So, welcome to Value Matters, your one stop destination for everything about making smart decisions to maximize value in supply chain. My name is Johann, and I'm your host, and I'm here to bring you the insights, the strategies, the success stories from experts from all around the world. Today, we are gonna talk about something very important, a slightly different, more finance-oriented perspective on our supply chains. Our supply chains are the beating heart of our companies. It's where big ideas, plans, strategies becomes reality. But being at the crossroads of multiple departments isn't always an easy place to be. And we have to say that the objectives we are given are quite often and too often conflicting. If you've ever been facing the urge of reducing inventory and delivering faster while multiplying SKUs and supporting a long list of marketing initiatives at the same time, this podcast episode is for you. Indeed, in this episode, we'll be interviewing Bram Desmet and discuss about how to align every department towards a common goal using a framework he calls the supply chain triangle of service, cost, and cash. So welcome on board. Fasten your seatbelts and get ready for a deep dive into the world of value creation in supply chain. It's time to make value matters. So, welcome to Value Matters, a proud and non-sponsored podcast whose only aim is to help you ensure that your supply chain is effectively profitable. And this is already our third episode, and today I'm really excited to introduce you to another fantastic expert. I have to admit that I've been following his work for quite a few years already, but his first book has been waiting on my reading list for way too long. Yet this summer I finally found time to read it in depth, and guess what? I really loved it. So imagine how excited I am to welcome Professor Bram Desmet to this show. Welcome to the show, Bram.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Johan.
My pleasure. Bram is a recognized thought leader, and his unique expertise is in linking advanced analytics, supply chain models, strategy all together. Bram is also the author of two books so far on this very topic, and if I'm right, a third one is currently in the writing process. He is the CEO of Solventure, a firm based in the beautiful city of Ghent in Belgium, and he is also a professor of operations and supply chain at the renowned Vlerick Business School in Belgium and a guest lecturer at the Peking University. But the best would probably be to let Bram introduce himself a little bit. So, Bram, could you please tell us more about your story so far?
Yeah, well, thanks again, Johan, for having me in this podcast. Yes, so I'm Bram Desmet. I would say above all, I grew into a supply chain fanatic, and uh, I started my career in IT. I moved from IT into supply chain. I did a lot of inventory optimization projects, which was quite technical. Also, my PhD was on multi-echelon inventory optimization. I was trained as a mathematician, so you could say I really come from that analytical background. And gradually, I zoomed out and to solve easy questions like how much inventory do we really need? I had to make the link to finance because inventory is working capital and working capital is cash. I had to make a link to strategy in the sense that different strategies lead to a different level of inventory. A hard discounter has less inventory than a traditional supermarket because they have a smaller assortment. So before I knew, I was, instead of really in the details, I was somewhere very strategic, basically, when I wrote that first book. And it's been great fun because I think there is still so much value that supply chain management can bring to companies. It's hugely underestimated. It's also poorly understood both by supply chain people and especially by non-supply chain people. That gradually it grew into a mission to try to uh, to try to be an ambassador for the evolution of supply chain as a discipline, and educating both supply chain and non-supply chain people on how to better turn those supply chain into a competitive advantage.
Sure. Great. A great mission so far, and you're doing well. You're doing pretty well.
Thank you.
You're now also the CEO of Solventure. Maybe you could share a little bit about what the kind of services or solutions you're delivering to your customers, the kind of customers you're helping as well.
Yeah. I think in the broader sense, we do supply chain transformations. We really grew from tooling implementation, so implementations of advanced planning software and the implementation of S01E03. But as we may also further explore, S01E03 is not a goal in itself. People come to me and say, Bram, we want to improve S01E03. And I typically start from the triangle we will talk about, like how's your service level? It's good. The cost is okay. Inventory is not a problem because we are a family-owned company and we are cash rich. And then I say, yeah, but if you don't have problems, maybe you don't need S01E03, right? So S01E03 is only a means to an end. And being able to connect, I would say, with the executive team to understand, okay, where is the supply chain slowing us down financially or strategically? What needs to be changed and improved, and then helping companies to realize that and supply chain is very data intensive or information intensive, so then good systems are important to do that transformation. But that's what we've been doing for the last 15 years. Today a team of around 70 people, and I would say thanks to Corona, everybody understands that if the goods are not flowing, you get into a lot of financial and other troubles. I would say it's a growing field, so we're also growing the company with many happy customers.
Great, amazing. For today's episode, and before we jump and deep dive into the core topic, I would propose to structure the discussion into two main parts. For the first part, we will really focus on introducing our audience, our listeners who might have never heard about the supply chain triangle to the supply chain triangle concept and why it matters. So we'll really go from scratch, from the basics down to the concept, and then as we will all be on the same page, we'll try to develop on that concept, maybe to discuss some potential limits or not. I mean, does it really apply to any type of supply chain or any type of business? And also we try to understand how this could be linked to other key topics such as strategy. You already talked about that, about sustainability, about probabilistic thinking. So a lot of more advanced topics that I think are definitely related to the supply chain triangle and this kind of mindset.
Yep.
But let's start with the basics. Let's introduce the concepts, and I think that maybe the simplest question to start with is, what's your definition of a supply chain?
Yeah, I gradually discovered, I would say, that when I started reading books, everything was about our supply chain is a flow of goods, and it's an inverse flow of information and an inverse flow of cash. And it goes from the customers to the supplier. That's the score definition. And when I wrote that first book, I said, but that's not the daily struggle I see with supply chain managers. The daily struggle I see with supply chain managers is to balance the triangle, the triangle of service, cost, and cash. And cost is all kinds of operational cost, logistics cost, manufacturing cost, procurement cost. Cash I use as an equivalent for working capital. And working capital is, so three important components are the inventory. You add the receivables, the money you still need to receive from your customers, and you can subtract the payables, the money you still need to pay to your suppliers. If that working capital goes up, you need to add cash from a financial perspective. Finance typically prefers the working capital to go down because it's releasing cash. Releasing cash which can be used for investments or to finance operating costs, whatever. And then service, an important supply chain metric is the on time and full delivery performance, but I often need to say service is much more than that. It's also about how flexible I am. Yeah. Can any customer order at any time in any quantity, or do I impose certain restrictions? How narrow or broad is the product portfolio? And I saw supply chain managers struggling with that. And then year one, we had service issues, then we fixed the service issues, but then we had too much inventory. Then we had too much inventory. We fixed the inventory problem, but then the costs were not under control. And so the first really basic starting point of that triangle was also giving a tool to supply chain people to drive a different type of conversation. So when people started using the triangle, they say, hey, Bram, it's really helpful, because if I'm in a discussion with sales, I draw the triangle and I say, hey, but you are over here on the service side. We also need to reflect on what is the impact on the cost side or on the inventory side. Or finance would want inventories to go down, and then you can draw a triangle and say, hey, but you're on this side of the triangle, but if you're pushing inventories down, we also need to understand the cost impact or the service impact. So that's really the absolute basics of the supply chain triangle. And just by drawing that triangle, I saw that it was already used by supply chain practitioners in trying to drive a different type of discussion with their colleagues in the organization.
Okay, and so basically it means that it's recognizing that in supply chains there are three different kind of drivers or goals, each being a focus of one specific department. The service is usually owned by or the attention for the sales team, sales department. The finance is looking at this cash element, which is really important for the good health of the company, and the cost usually from these operations themselves. And here, this supply chain, what this supply chain triangle brings to or makes it easy to understand to anyone is that each of those are linked all together, and you can't just change one without impacting the others in a positive or negative way.
Yep.
And that's the strength and the power of this very simple tool, is really to make that understandable to anyone. Still, you said this, for example, service is usually seen as OTIF, which is a rather operational metric, but it could be more than that. It could be how the kind of facility or how easy we make ordering to our customers or delivering to our customers, or maybe sometimes using the goods themselves. It could be trainings about the tools, educating the customers themselves. All of this is part of the service, but how would you recommend to translate this operational metric into a finance one, to monetize this service, in fact?
Yeah. Well, let me first reflect on what you commented. For sure, I see that salespeople are more on the service side of that triangle, yeah? And operations people are typically more sitting on the cost side of the triangle, and it's often finance who, from a cash flow perspective, wants to reduce inventories and reduce payables, so they are more pushing the cash side of the triangle. And supply chain is probably the only function that has targets on the three corners, because supply chain often has that on time in full KPI. Supply chain quite often is responsible for logistics and has logistics cost as a KPI. And supply chain in many companies has been made responsible for the inventory and has an impact on the cash side. So so the fact that we still live in functional silos, and that each silo has their own targets, creates that stretch on the on the triangle. And supply chain is because supply chain is the only one who has a target across the three corners. To me, it feels like, yes, it's like supply chain is then a bit in the middle and needs to try to see, but how do how do I bring the colleagues together, right? And somebody even once asked me, he said, Bram, is this not how companies work? And won't there always be conflicting objectives between sales and operations and finance, and will different departments not always talk a different language? And so once you realize the stretch in the triangle, the question becomes, is this okay? Is this good? Or is this problematic? Yeah? And that's a second insight I got when thinking that through, and when and also through working with companies around that triangle, and getting those questions. And also your question, like, service related metrics, can we monetize that? For me, the answer is yes. In a profit driven company, in a for-profit company, if you improve your service, you should basically do it to sell more, right? Sell more in volume, or get a better price. And so if I have a broader product portfolio, I can hope that it will increase the sales. Yeah. Or if I'm more flexible towards customers, yeah, I should hope that they prefer to buy from me compared to a competitor who is less flexible. So service should be a driver for the sales of the company. Yeah, but if you take two steps back, and if you look at the triangle from an investor's perspective, you say, you know what, sales is important, but it's not only about the sales or a sales related metric like growth. At least in the long run, I also want to see a margin. Well, if I combine the service or the sales with the cost side of the triangle, I get to a margin, right? And that's a tricky one. As an investor, I say it's also not just about a margin. And why is that? Well, if I have two companies who generate 50 million of margin, but the first company requires 100 million of capital or cash, the second company requires only 50 million of capital or cash, then obviously, the return in the second company is better than the return in the first company. So in the end, as an investor, I say it's about what's the margin you generate over that capital employed, the cash you use. In financial terms, the return on capital employed. So it also means that, some balance or optimizing that triangle is important, because optimizing that triangle is about optimizing the financial value you generate from a shareholder perspective. And it means multiple things. It means that it's not optional. It's really mandatory, right? So it's not just okay that sales and operations and finance pull in a different direction. And given that supply chain is there, all of a sudden you get a responsibility to align the different functions, and you become like responsible for optimizing the value for the shareholder. That's it. All of a sudden gives a completely different perspective to supply chain. Supply chain is no longer just operational, customer service, and logistics, but it comes to the heart of the value generation in a company. And it also means that, basically finance and supply chain have the same objective. It's about value generation. And I think the average finance person doesn't understand supply chain, and the average supply chain person doesn't understand finance. Yeah? They seem to live in separate worlds and work in separate worlds, but they really have the same ambition and the same. So if they would better align the forces, I think that there's also a big opportunity for supply chain to have much more impact in that triangle.
And monetizing each of those corners metrics is the first step towards that alignment and better understanding of each and a common language between each department. Because if you don't have this common layer, you can't even understand each other. They not really understand why this OTIF has this impact on the sales, or on the cash, or on the costs. So monetizing is the first step, and then it allows deriving some more advanced metrics that became a kind of North Star metric for the whole company, that single metric that everyone should be aligned towards and try to optimize. So that's what I got as the key output from this supply chain triangle tool, is really getting to that metric and using it as a guide to align everyone's targets and be sure that we don't have conflicting objectives, or because it's a way to solve these conflicts, in fact.
Yeah.
But this means that we should be more finance oriented in supply chain as well. We are not used to, or not all of us are used to discuss about return on investment, discuss about cash, capital employed, and so on. Does that mean that we should be more finance literate or finance oriented in the way we look at our metrics and in the way we discuss them when we are at the table with the top management and so on?
Definitely. And I think not every supply chain professional is ready for that. Some people are scared about that. And but so it's like you are at a crossroads, and on the one hand, as supply chain, we are frustrated that we don't have more impact. I think we can have much more impact, but then we will need to learn to speak the language of finance, because money talks. Yeah? And my feeling is that, and I don't mean that negatively, some supply chain people don't want to make that move, and that's fine. Yeah, but then for me, you will be in customer service and logistics. Don't call that supply chain. And for me, the mission of supply chain should then be much more really balancing that triangle and optimizing the value in that triangle through processes like SNOP or IBP, and also by playing a much more active role in the strategic discussions in the company, like how do we design the service side of that corner, and what is the impact on the costs? Yeah? And if we make more costs, yeah, is the customer then also willing to pay for that? I'll give a simple example. What should be the target on time in full, OTIF? In many companies, sales is deciding that. Yeah? Or sales is deciding make to stock, make to order. Sales should not decide that. Why? Because sales doesn't understand the impact. Yeah? So we should not accept that sales decides make to stock, make to order. Or sales has decided the lead time will be 2 weeks. That's the order lead time, but the manufacturing lead time is 4 weeks. That doesn't really help. It's either 0 weeks or 4 weeks. Yeah. So taking a more active control of these discussions as a moderator at the heart of that triangle, I think that there's a huge opportunity for supply chain people to contribute value in a completely different way, not in operational firefighting, but in being much more proactive and helping the organization to make better design decisions and take better decisions, like on a tactical horizon, like should we accept that order from that Russian customer, yes or no? What could be the impact on the top line? What could be the potential impact on the inventory if we still get in trouble with the payments or so on later on? So better balancing the metrics on the three corners. I think that's where supply chain can add a lot of value. But yes, we will need to improve our financial literacy.
But and as you said earlier, we are in the supply chain people are in the most legitimate to own this general alignment between the company, between the different departments, because they already are in the middle of these different departments, conflicting targets and objectives, and they better understand each one goals and how to balance and mitigate the different elements. So it's kind of a new role, a new place within the company to embrace. It could be, I think that finance could be also really interested in owning this tool or this process. Why would supply chain be really more legitimate than finance on that?
That's a very sensitive question. It is, because I come from supply chain, right? So I'm looking like how can we uh, increase the relevance of supply chain in general, and plus also what do I believe makes sense from a company perspective. And I think indeed finance finance could be the other candidate to manage that triangle. I believe supply chain is the better candidate, though finance doesn't like that. And why do I believe? Let me start here. If I ask to salespeople, like, who would you like to centrally manage that triangle, supply chain or finance? Then salespeople will say, if I need to choose, I'd rather have supply chain. Because if finance is doing it, my costs will be under control and my cash will be under control, but I may be left without customers. Yeah. So, but the impression I have is that if finance seems to have a less rich experience really across the three corners of the triangle, and the finance function is in crisis because finance used to be accounting. The whole accounting is being automated. Like all their processes are going, so they are in an existential crisis, and the whole talk in finance now is we want to be a business partner. And then I ask finance people, but if you want to be a business partner, what have you then been over the last 30 years? What I'm sure is that supply chain has been a business partner over the last 30 years. Yeah, but it feels threatening to to finance people. Why? Because the impact and the status finance has in the organization is way above the status that supply chain has. Yeah, so if the CFO decides that the inventory needs to be reduced with 10%, everybody does it, even if it's a stupid thing to do. Yeah, and my feeling is that the status versus the impact is the other way around. So I think supply chain has much more impact on the value than finance. Yeah, because it's really at the heart of that triangle. But supply chain doesn't have the status. So it's in the beginning I took the revolutionary approach. And I said, okay, we're going to push all the finance people out of all the CFOs out of the company. As a VP supply chain or chief supply chain officer, we will just take over the finance department because accounting can't be that difficult. If you can plan a complex supply chain, accounting cannot be that difficult. Yeah, but as I become older, I become milder. So I say, instead of chasing finance out of the building, maybe we should see how we can better collaborate with finance. That's the more polite answer I came to realize, maybe more productive as well.
Sure. Now I understand why you said it was a sensitive question.
Yeah.
Definitely. This supply chain triangle could be a tool that could be viewed from two different perspectives. It could be a tool to look at the past performance, right? What kind of return on capital employed we got this year, this last month compared to last year, the same month or so on. But it could also be a tool used to kind of better align on the objectives we want for the future. And I think that's where it has the real value, because even though it's important to know the kind of performance you had in the past, it's the past. It won't change anything, and that's already done. What matters is really making it better in the future and being sure to address the right stakes. How do you concretely use this tool in an S01E03 session, for example? When do you use the supply chain triangle? Do you have an example? For example, previously you said, okay, if the finance is saying, okay, you should reduce your inventory by X%. This might be a good idea or not. How would you use concretely the supply chain triangle in such a conversation? Is it within the S01E03 process? Is it in another kind of meeting? Really to really know hands-on what's the kind of applications we could have.
Yeah. Let me start with that question again, like finance says we need to reduce the inventory with 10%. Also, as my thinking evolves, some opinions get stronger, and I'm increasingly more convinced that finance should not be allowed to decide on their own that the inventory should be reduced with 10%, because finance doesn't understand the impact of that on the cost and on the service. Yeah. So again, increasingly, I'm convinced that this type of decisions should be made in a cross-functional team. Yeah? Somebody of finance should be there because the imperative could come from finance. Yeah? Basically, what finance says is we need to guarantee a certain cash flow. That's what they want. That's what they need.
That's the core need. Yeah.
Yeah. And yeah, we need to analyze what could be the contribution from an inventory, from a receivables, from a payables perspective. And if you look at the inventory, yeah, I think commercial people could be involved in the sense like, is there any opportunities to clean up the product portfolio? I think manufacturing people could be involved to say, okay, what are the options to reduce inventory by producing smaller batches? Yeah. And even R&D could be involved in the sense that can we redesign some of our products in the sense that instead of having a make to stock, it becomes an assemble to order, or like a postponement strategy that we say we need to keep less inventory of finished products, and then we will do a last minute differentiation. And so what finance would today do is just give, or CEOs and CFOs give conflicting targets. You grow the business with 10%, you cut cost with 10%, and you reduce the inventory with 10%. I often say, if you do that, what happens? 3 months later, you have chaos, or the strongest one wins. If you're a sales-driven company, then sales always wins. If you're an operations-driven company, then operations always wins. But that's for me management of the 60s. This is not modern management. So first of all, it means, so you could even say that the triangle means that, yeah, we need to better think through as cross-functional teams. Yeah. If we have a certain objective, and that could be to grow in a certain market or to generate a certain cash flow, what is the smartest way to do that, and what is the impact across the triangle? So I think it should be a discussion tool in cross-functional teams to jointly come to smarter decisions instead of making poor decisions. That's the first one. And the second thing is that yeah, it should indeed be forward-looking and not just backward-looking. And so what I see there today is that supply chain has an S&OP process. In a lot of companies, it's very detailed, and it's still primarily volume-driven. Yeah. Finance has their FP&A process. Yeah. Which is then more high level. I still see a lot of companies where sales even needs to submit 2 forecasts. We need to submit the forecast at the detailed level to the supply chain department, and we need to submit a financial forecast on an aggregated level, and one is in volumes and the other is in values, in euros or in dollars. And also that, as my thinking evolves, we should no longer accept that. Finance doesn't want to rely on the planning process of supply chain because they don't trust them and they want to do their own thing. Yeah. And maybe 5 or 6 years ago, I understood why, because many supply chain planning processes are also not mature enough to financially steer the business. But in today's uncertain market situations, I say to finance people, it's completely irresponsible not to give supply chain access to the right financial information. Because basically you are forcing supply chain people to make decisions. Supply chain manager or the planner makes decisions, yeah, but he doesn't understand the true financial impact. Yeah? And if you look at the core of an FP&A process or a budget process and of an S&OP process, the core is the same. So you make if you make a forecast in units, you can also make a forecast in values. You translate that sales forecast into a production plan. If you know what you're going to produce, basically you can also assess the cost of that. What's the variable cost? What's the fixed cost? But I understand the cost component of that. And I can perfectly make a working capital forecast. If I'm in a seasonal business and I know that I will need to pre-build stock, in the S&OP, I know that the inventory will go up. So I know it will be consuming cash, right? And so in the core, these two processes can be exactly the same. The tools today perfectly allow us to do that, but it's basically the functional silos and the politics in the executive team and the lack of trust from finance and supply chain and the lack of understanding from supply chain on the financial processes, which makes that it's not happening. And maybe pre-COVID, I could still accept. If the market grows with 10% a year and it's year on year, it's the same and everything is relatively stable, maybe it's still fine. But if you look at the turbulence we've had over the last 3 years, first COVID, then hurricanes, Suez Canal, Russia-Ukraine war. So there's so much volatility in today's supply chains that not bringing the financial information to the decision table of supply chain and of S&OP, again, for me, it's poor management. And mentally, I no longer accept.
Okay, so but the supply chain triangle is both a rather simple tool to align everyone on the same, so that to ensure everyone's on the same page and understand each one constraints and the impacts of changing one of the corners metric toward a given goal. But it's also, if we follow the path far enough, it really advocate for a deep change, a revolution in the way we currently approach all the planning activities and the roles within the company, making supply chain, which is already at the heart of the activities of the company, really at the table of the decisions, and not just as cost of service or a department that has less impact on the decision making, on the strategical decision making, because their decisions are so important.
And people are afraid of that. That's why in the beginning I was maybe still hesitating, like, is this the right thing to do? But I mean, the essence is the following. We can only optimize the triangle if we break the silos.
Sure.
Yeah? And if we better align processes.
And
so that's what I increasingly believe, that that is the right thing to do, because if we don't break the silos and if everybody stays on their island, then it's almost like, yeah, we can do an attempt to align, but okay, we're always after the facts, and then I say, yeah, but I mean, it doesn't make sense, because I mean, it would almost be like saying that we're not interested in driving the value for the shareholder or the return on the investments we are doing. So no, I'm gradually turning it around. So if you say no, but driving that value and optimizing that triangle, that's the primary goal, then we need to get organized around that. And then it means that if there is a risk for suboptimal decisions because sales doesn't understand the full impact or finance doesn't understand the full impact, we should no longer accept that a division on their own makes a decision from which we know it's going to be suboptimal, but we should make it in a committee I also believe that, and these will be things which are also part of the new book, that it's so complex. So you can't blame salespeople for not understanding everything for operations, or operations not understanding everything of finance. So today supply chains have become so complex that it's also okay. You know what? Relax. It's okay that we are going to gather 4 or 5 people from a different department. We are going to think it through. And with the best possible information, we are going to make the best possible decision for the company. So instead of power play and everybody's going for their targets, we're going to better use each other's brains to make better decisions for the companies. And instead of different departments running their own process, we're going to look how we can at least start from a common foundation. So if I rephrase like that, it shouldn't be that threatening, but I do feel, because it's changing the dynamic, and every executive team member over the last 50 years has grown in a world where the functional silos and the functional targets are dominant. So everybody thinks that that's the way it has to be run. And I'm increasingly convinced that I say that's a management style of the 60s. If we truly want to drive value and also better align and better realize the strategies, because if we're not aligned in the triangle, it not only has a financial impact, it also has a strategic impact, and it also has a sustainability impact. So the stakes are also much bigger than we
and much more complex.
than we would realize at first sight. So it's in that sense that triangle is deceivingly simple. Like, it's so simple, and people easily relate to that. Supply chain people, financial people, commercial people. So it helps people to connect, but it's deceivingly simple in the sense that the impact of the triangle goes way beyond what I also initially realized.
Yeah. So for those who listen to us and think, okay, this vision is definitely better than the current silos and the issues we are facing, implementing the supply chain triangle is definitely the more pragmatic first step to start making everyone more and listening to each other's constraints and goals and own stakes. So definitely a great point. I think regarding the definition of a supply chain triangle, you already did a great job so far. And for those who really want to dive deeper in the concept, I really recommend reading your first book. I haven't read the second one yet, so I think I have a lot to learn but this book is really great. It goes really down to the tiny details about why this specific metric and not this one. And also I like that there's a lot of real world examples, real companies with examples of supply chain triangles, how to analyze the results, the kind of insights we could gather from that. So really hands-on book for everyone who wants to kind of be part of the transformation of its own company. Now, let's go to the second part of the discussion, and it's mostly about questions I ask myself reading the book, or afterwards, and I was not sure to get to the right answer, so I wanted to have this opportunity is a way for me to learn, and I'll be sharing that with the listeners as well. In the book, you make and in the discussion you make a strong case for using this return on capital employed metric as the key metric for anyone in the company. And really, the way you present it really makes sense. It sounds to make sense, and I think it does. But I had two questions regarding that. I asked myself, is it really the return on capital employed, this ratio, the goal we should be following, or is it always better if the ROC is better, then the performance is better? Is it that easy, or is there something else? Let me make this clear with an example. if I have a company which require $10 million of cash and generates a $2 million margin, I have a 20% return on capital employed, which is great. If I have another company which is a 100 million cash company and it generates 10 million EBIT, so this time it's 10% return on capital employed. For sure, the capital employed is twice lower. And from an ROCE perspective and from an investor perspective, it's better to invest in the 20% ROCE company rather than the second one. But when we are within the company, we don't make the choice to invest in this company or in another one. We have to invest in our own company. And from this perspective, I think that 100 million, 10 million margin is better than a 2 million one. Even though the ROCE is lower, it generates more revenue for the company. So I would think that if we are to compare companies between each other, the ROCE is a better metric. But within one single company, maybe we should be more interested in the absolute margin. But at the same time, I understand that it's silly to discard the investment in front of this part. What's your take on this?
Yeah, I would have two reflections. Like, my question would be, what can we do to grow the 10 million company into a 100 million company while keeping the 20% ROCE? So that would be a first question. So, and the second question is that, okay, if we have the 100 million company with a 10 million margin, so 10% ROCE, what are the peers doing? Like, I might do 100 million. I might have a competitor who does 90. I might have a competitor who does 200. Yeah. What is their return they are delivering? And yeah, even if I'm not investing as a person in my own company, I would say, also from the analysis I have done, like, ROCE is almost also like how healthy is the company and how successful is the company. And if healthier companies and more successful companies attract more talent, so it's easier for them to attract better people. It's easier for them to attract investors or have a better financing from the bank. And so ROCE, that was also one of my surprises. It's not used by finance. So finance doesn't measure it. And when I discussed with the CFO, he said to me, yeah, but Bram, okay, look at the capital employed. The capital employed is the working capital plus the fixed assets. And he said, yeah, but the fixed assets are relatively fixed, so there's not much I can do about it. So he seemed to be much more interested in the working capital than in the fixed assets. And if you look at nominator, it's so return on capital employed is EBIT, and he says, yeah, so that's earnings before interest and taxes. And he said, yeah, I prefer to look at EBITDA. So before depreciation and amortization, because also my depreciation and amortization is relatively fixed. So there's not a lot I can change about the D and the A. So I prefer to look at EBITDA instead of EBIT. And okay, on the one hand, it gave me a feeling of what is finance then concerned about. But if you think it through, it also shows that finance is really concerned about short-term metrics. Working capital, I can influence. EBITDA, I can influence. And the D and the A, I can't influence. I don't care, but listen, if I want to be successful in a certain market, also my fixed assets will be important, and maybe I need to invest in capex, and that will drive a certain DNA. So because finance was not using it in the beginning, I was discouraged, and then I said, yeah, maybe I should give it up, that ROCE as a metric. Now I turn it around again. I say to supply chain people, you should ask to be measured on ROCE. Say to finance, you measure me on ROCE. Like, don't tell me you need to reduce inventories with 10%, you need to reduce cost with 10%, you need to do this. No macromanagement. Eh? You measure me on the output, and the output is how I drive value, right? And I think in the first or in the second book, I mean, I've also done studies like, basically, let's put it like so. Somebody at Henkel told me, Bram, but we as an executive team are measured on earnings per share. Again, ROCE is not there. And earnings per share is then more linked to the return on equity, and this could be a bit technical. And return on equity, it's on the equity instead of on the capital employed, and it's on the net profit instead of on the EBIT. But then I say, as supply chain, net profit, yeah, that accounts for the taxes and for the interests. As supply chain, I don't have an impact on the interest rates or on the taxation, right? That's really a finance thing. Yeah. And the difference between the capital employed and the equity is, for instance, how much debt do I have versus how much equity do I have, right? And again, the debt to equity structure as operations or supply chain, I don't influence. Yeah. So that's again a finance thing. So I understand that finance looks at earnings per share, but the way we contribute to earnings per share is by driving ROCE. If the ROCE is good, we will always get to a good earnings per share. If the ROCE is crap, we may do a lot of financial engineering and open offices in the Cayman Islands or wherever in the world still to come to an attractive earnings per share, but it's a less commonly used metric by finance, ROCE. But if I think it through, if I discuss also with like business unit presidents, everybody agrees that it's a very good metric to kind of measure the intrinsic value generation in a business unit, and also I would say the fundamental health of a business unit. So I've been going through ups and downs, like finance doesn't use it, maybe I should give it up. But no, I mean, the more I have discussed with companies and the more I think about it, yeah, the more the stronger I get. And I tell that to supply chain directors today. I said, you should ask to be measured on ROCE.
That makes sense for sure. Still, I think that if we optimize towards ROC to maximize this, we might. This means literally that at some stage we might decide to not go for some extra revenue, because this extra revenue would have cost us a little bit more, and this would have decreased our ROC. So it's no more about driving as much sales as possible, which is good. But at the same time, if those extra sales would have changed our ROCE from 20 to 19, maybe that's worth it. And maybe you're absolutely right. I think the finance team we should ask to be measured on the ROCE, and the finance team should measure our performance based on that. But maybe the company or the finance or the CEO should kind of ask for a minimum ROCE value, and we should try to maximize the margin respecting that minimum, instead of going for the optimal ROCE, we might go for the higher margin respecting a minimum ROCE constraints. But it's just a raw idea, but from my perspective, it would have align both worlds, going for the maximum margin and the maximum revenue, and at the same time ensuring that ROCE is our core metric, and that the company is happy with the ROCE we deliver.
It's an interesting remark, and my gut feeling is I don't agree. And I'll try to explain why, but I never had this question nor this discussion before. That I think sales should be driven from a good strategic positioning.
Mm-hmm.
No, so growth should be driven from a good strategic and sharp positioning. And growth should not be driven by opportunistic behavior by sales. So yeah, I can imagine it says, hey, but I could sell this, but it's at a little bit lower price. And that's opportunistic behavior, right? And opportunistic behavior could be good from a short-term perspective, but I think it's bad from a long-term perspective, because the question is, hey, but why is that customer not paying the price that we would expect the customer to pay that price? Maybe because what that customer values is not what we are trying to put in the market, right? I even see a risk that opportunistic behavior yeah, gradually erodes your margins and your financial structure, and also dilutes your strategic positioning. And what I do recognize is that short-term pressure. So sales will be there, and they say, "Oh, but yeah, maybe it's a little bit less good from an ROC perspective, but and we can still get that order, and it's still good for the business." No, we should basically we should tell sales, instead of bringing us customers who want to pay less, your job is to bring us the customer who wants to pay more. So the power of sales is so big, and the short-term pressure is so big that we are inclined to accept this as a situation, and that makes the link to strategy. So strategy literature clearly says, like, the sharper your strategic value proposition is, also the easier it is to define the corresponding supply chain, the right level of cost, the right level of inventory. And okay, there could be turbulence in the market, which means that sometimes you need to do tactical moves. But a competitor is going bankrupt. So okay, let's try to grab 5 or 10% extra market share. We know it will not be at the right level of cost of inventory. Tactical, I can still understand and accept. Opportunistic, we should stop salespeople from being opportunistic. That's not driving value. It may be driving sales. Yeah, it may be driving growth, but it's not sustainable growth. It's diluting your financial model, and it's diluting your strategic positioning.
Definitely agreeing on the opportunistic kind of decisions, which would be bad business. But I was more thinking about kind of defining the service level in a higher than an optimal one would be, to grab those extra sales and this extra revenue, and that would degrade
but
it's more tactical decisions.
Yeah, but that becomes tactical, and that's again what you can use the triangle to evaluate and say, okay, and I would say it in the end, it's almost an investor's decision. Like,
exactly, yeah.
Are you happy with a lower ROCE to take a bigger part of the market? And my concern would even be less than be from a financial perspective. My bigger concern would be, are we not blurring our service positioning in the market and our strategic positioning? Like, or is maybe our base positioning then simply not good enough, that we need to do extra tricks to get to that extra? That makes me think of, like, you have the hard discounters, Aldi and Lidl. And like, it's less today, but like 2 years ago, everybody was like moving, and Lidl was like more putting focus on fresh assortments. And I think potentially also trying to attract extra consumers by better fresh assortments. But and if you start differentiating in product quality, it has an impact on cost and on capital employed, because maybe you need to do more frequent transports, or to make sure that everything stays fresh, you need a different type of container which is cooled or what have you.
Potential wastes.
Yeah, and if it's increasing the cost, yeah, it gets conflicting with your lowest price positioning. And so I see companies doing tactical moves to grab a bit of market share, but I mean, on the longer term, it's dangerous, because if you shift and you become a little bit more expensive, you leave a bit of space really on the low end of the market, maybe for a new entrant, right? Somebody who then says, yeah, no, I'm really going to focus again on the lowest cost. And in general, I would say any decision is good as long as it's a conscious decision across the three sides of the corner. And also, if you very well understood what is the shorter term and the longer term impact. That's maybe a bit why I give pushback, because my feeling is companies don't work like that. Sales doesn't care, like they haven't thought that through, and they just want to bring in extra orders, whatever the cost and whatever the inventory impact, because they want to get their bonus. And yeah, that type of macho type of company management is not driving value, and I have left that behind. I say that's management of the 60s. For me, it's completely unprofessional. It's completely inadequate for the current turbulent times we live in. And if I would be an investor, any executive which behaves like that would immediately be fired, and I would replace him preferably as somebody who has spent some time in supply chain, because those people have a much better and holistic view of the company.
That was a really, really interesting answer, and the question was quite tough, I have to admit. And I'm not sure. I hope the next one would be easier, but I'm not really sure as well. I recently came across a totally different type of supply chain. So we were discussing with a worldwide, very large, very renowned CPG company, literally hundreds of manufacturing plants across the world, and they had two supply chains. They had their usual CPG goods production supply chain and for the goods they are selling, and they had also decisions and supply chain to be made for the spare parts, the maintenance of their plants, to ensure that the manufacturing doesn't stop, or if it stops as short time as possible, and it operates 100% of the time if possible. When it comes to that kind of use, when you maintain an infrastructure that you own, there's no. I find it hard to define the revenue corner of a triangle, because you're not selling those goods. They are more like an insurance for your activity, and kind of measuring the performance of this specific supply chain, which in this case, in the case of a specific customer, what's huge. Maybe for smaller companies, it's a tiny one, we don't really care. But for this one, it was really hundreds of millions of dollars of value. How would you approach such a case with the supply chain triangle? Is it applicable in such a case or not? And I don't have any idea about the answer.
No, as I would say, there is an indirect impact on the revenues, and the impact might even not be directly on the sales revenues, because okay, if a machine breaks down, you cannot produce, but you could still have inventory. So the impact on the sales towards consumers is, so the impact towards retailers is delayed, and then the retailer might still have stock. So the impact on lost sales, I think in general, would be very hard to quantify. So I think in this situation, it's very hard, or probably even impossible, to quantify what would be the sales impact. So and in that sense, yeah, also then what is the return, or what is the ROCE? I think it's hard or it's impossible. And what I, of course, what you would try to do is then try to approximate. And I think it would be quite common to assess the criticality and say, okay, if this part is missing, how critical is it? If that part is missing, how critical is it? So you would still try to understand what is the criticality of the different spare parts, but yeah, and you would still try to optimize and say, okay, what are the options like, and also how does the cost balance versus the inventory? Am I going to put spare parts everywhere, or am I going to put spare parts close to a hub of DHL, which allows me to cover all of Europe within 24 hours? And do I even need the spare parts? Or for which type of parts could I invest instead of inventory in a 3D printer so I can print stuff? So I think you certainly trading off costs versus inventories versus capex in 3D printing. I think there's still a lot of the triangle thinking that remains applicable, but assessing the financial impact, I think, is much harder.
So
And
using
the sales impact is much
yeah.
harder. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Got it. I will reflect on that as well to kind of move forward. But I came to the very same conclusion so far. So
Yeah.
I was hoping to find a way to get out of the trap.
No. No.
Time's going on. I still have. Do you still have time for one or two
Yes.
questions?
Yeah.
I will try to pick the most interesting ones. I was wondering whether you've already seen this supply chain triangle applied to in conjunction with probabilistic thinking, scenario planning, risk management, to kind of say, okay, we are here, but the ROCE we predict is something like between 18 and 22, but we have this second scenario which brings a lower ROCE, but likely a ROCE, but there's less risk in that scenario. Do you have already seen this kind of use of the supply chain triangle, or is it not too advanced yet? We should yet already embrace the deterministic version of the supply chain triangle and then try to move forward.
Yeah. I've not. I think yes, I have. I have seen ROCE scenarios in finance, but really more in the strategic planning horizon, where they say, okay, that's what the former CFO told me. He said, we use it ROCE, but really in the strategic planning, like what is the ROCE of the different businesses we have in the portfolio? It's also like for corporate strategy. How is business unit 1 to 30 doing from an ROCE perspective? What are the growth perspectives? And if we invest, yes or no, how could the ROCE evolve? And it was, I think they were also using it at a group level to drive investment decisions and say, okay, there's always more capex requirements than there is capex to spend, or capex requests than there is capex to spend. So on a strategic level, they were doing that. I already told that finance is not using ROCE, so they're not projecting it. I think it should not be that difficult from a good SNOP tool and process to project key components. You can project the top line, you should be able to project the EBITDA, you should be able to project the working capital in euros. So for sure you could project key components and you could project ROCE. I've not seen it, but it's feasible, it's possible. Also, again, in my new book, I want to elaborate in more detail on how it can practically be done. If you can do it, you can do scenario management, like, okay, this is option 1, this is option 2. Also do some risk assessments, like if we go for that option, there's always uncertainty on the forecast, like and it's not yet probabilistic, but you could say, okay, well, like what's like a minimum, a most likely, and a maximum scenario, so that at
best
least
worst case scenario.
you get some insights. And yeah, I'm a fan of the probabilistic thinking. That's linking back into the analytics background I have, is that it's double. In the one hand, like there is so many basic stuff to do in companies that if you bring the probabilistic capabilities too early, if your master data is no good, then garbage in will still be garbage out. But I see, for long I had the feeling that planning technology did not move on, because most of the advanced planning tools today do exactly the same what advanced planning tools were doing 40 years ago.
Most of them.
But there has been a lot of talk about AI, but I have not really seen a lot of AI applied and on the ground. And don't ask me why, and it's also just a feeling, but my feeling is that like the last 3 years, I really see a lot of AI startups which do probabilistic stuff, or which do large scale simulations, where they say, well, instead of calculating stuff, we just run 1 million simulations, and we take the best of the options to then feed as a solution into the planning. The last 3 years, I'm also more impressed with what I see startups doing, and my feeling is that these startups attract a lot of funding to get to a certain customer base, and the ones which are successful, I also see them being taken over then by the bigger bigger planning software companies who will integrate them. So it's probably still too early for a lot of companies, but I see a lot of startups who are bringing it to the market, and I'm sure that these will be integrated into the planning, bigger planning softwares. But the thing will remain the same. Like, technology will not be the inhibitor of the progress.
Sure.
The inhibitor of the progress will be rewiring people's brains, and I would say both supply chain brains and non-supply chain brains on, what do we really want to achieve? Is ROCE the metric or not? Yeah, and if it's not, but then what is the metric? Yeah, and are we sure that then? So, what do we want? What are the metrics? How are things in that interlinked? Who is deciding what? And in general, instead of working in silos, more working in cross-functional teams, and more holistic thinking, and more integrated thinking and decision making, and more integrating processes, and there the not the artificial intelligence, but the human intelligence will need to be developed. We will need to open people's eyes for a new reality.
Sure. It was really great fun and a real pleasure to discuss with you. Really insightful. I have so many questions I had to left on the table for future conversations, and I'm sure that from our listeners, they also have their own questions. If they want to reach out to you to know more about what you're doing at Solventure, or how we can help them, where should they go to get in touch?
If they go to LinkedIn, they connect with me, and if people reach out to me, I always try to respond, and depending on the type of questions, also set up a short call to further discuss on. In general, relatively easy to approach.
Sure, I can testify about that.
Yeah.
And just before we conclude, I usually have this ritual question about: do you have any books or authors or papers you would recommend for this specific podcast, Value Matters, which is about really ensuring that our initiatives are delivering profit to the company, that are impactful in a positive sense, and that would be valuable to the listeners as well? Do you have anything in mind? You could include your own books.
Yeah, but for sure, I would say people value my books.
Mm.
I had a discussion with my book publisher and a professor from Ecuador, I think, and we are looking to translate the books into Spanish because apparently for the Latin American market, yeah, people really prefer to read Spanish rather than English. And he said what makes Bram's books different is that um, they really make that link to financial impact and to strategic impact. And I don't think there's too many books who do that. You can read a book about network design and they say the strategy is an input, but they don't talk about the strategy, or they don't clarify how strategy has an impact on the network design. And we may look a lot at cost metrics, but so the broader value impact or linking it to other financial metrics like free cash flow or like earnings per share is not something you will find in those books. So I think for sure, if that's interesting to you, I would recommend that. And two other books come to mind. Books I've recently written is one book is called Donut Economics. So I'm reading myself into the sustainability topic. Also, my third book will try to link that whole supply chain triangle to the sustainability questions that supply chain managers also have on their plate today. And donut economics, yeah, gives donut economics redefines the basics and the basics of economic thinking, like the Homo economicus, the rational economic man. Like people are not always rational and money driven decision makers. So and the way she brings that is quite impressive. I was really impressed. The book is also very well written, so if you start reading it, it's easy to read and easy to digest. And the second one is a book from a gentleman called Ray Dalio. And let me just Google what, yeah. And so the name of that book is Changing World Order.
Mm-hmm.
And so he reflects on, okay, what makes nations rise and what makes nations fall. So how did the Dutch come to rise and then fall between the 16th and the 18th century, I think? How did the British Empire then came to rise and fall? That also sheds some light on the current rivalry between
Countries.
between the US and China, basically. The book is written by I think the founder of the biggest hedge fund in the US.
Okay.
It's a hedge fund owner, so it's also very quantitative. So he has defined KPIs which you can measure. So he defines a certain life cycle of nations. He defines where they are in their cycle. And the reason why he does it is because he wants to understand reserve currencies. And the current reserve currency is the US dollar. Basically, his question is when is it going to switch to the renminbi, right? And that's where the money is. That's his real interest. But he's sharing his research, and that also, I mean, and that's really from a macro perspective. It also gives some insights in. There's a lot of questions also in companies like, should we go regional for regional, or is it still safe to do sourcing in China? So I think it gives insights in the global, say, political and economic macro trends and evolutions. And if you really look at strategic supply chain questions, I would almost say like, well, those political economic drivers together with sustainability drivers are driving how you should design your supply chain for the next 5 to 10 years.
Mm.
And so again, if you're interested in that type of topics, it's a book I can recommend.
Definitely, I would add those to my
Yeah.
long waiting reading books list. There's a lot in there still, but definitely makes sense. And then, I heard about you talking about this donut economy book, and it really sounds really interesting. And definitely deep dive into that.
Super.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Bram. It's been really a pleasure. It's been fantastic having you for this episode and discussing this key topic, which is the supply chain triangle and how to link supply chain with finance. And as you said, there's very few people talking about that in depth and really bringing all the things together. So thank you very much for the time you spend with us. And I sincerely hope the listeners liked it as well. And see you soon, Bram. I hope to see you soon and keep on discussing these topics with you.
Yeah, my pleasure, Johan, and thank you for being an ambassador of supply chain thinking and making sure that we indeed educate people on new supply chain thinking and new supply chain models and see how we can add more financial value. And that's what I will discuss in the next book, how we can also contribute to a more sustainable world.
And that's a critical point as well. Thank you very much, Bram.
Yeah,
See you.
my pleasure.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Dear listeners, thank you also for your time. I hope you enjoy this episode. You find valuable insights in there. And remember, this podcast is yours. So really, if you have any suggestion for future interviews or episode topics, feel free to reach out, connect with me, share your ideas. I'm listening to you. And clearly the easiest way to connect with me is via my LinkedIn profile. So just let's get in touch. Also, if you enjoyed this episode, please share it with others, with your colleagues and peers, and leave a rating or a review. And make sure to subscribe to the podcast on your favorite platform to be sure not to miss any episode in the future. Thank you again for listening. I hope you'll join us again soon. And in the meantime, don't forget, in supply chain, more than anywhere else, value matters.